Okay, everyone, welcome back. Today we begin part 2 of our course, shifting from corporate governance to a further topic of corporate social responsibility, which is going to extend our discussion of corporate governance and look at a whole bunch of new issues. We're going to pick up also on the theme of stakeholder theory. So to transition between part 1 and part 2 of our course, we need to rethink a bit what could effective corporate governance mean. In economics of agency theory, we saw that there was a pretty strict focus on shareholder value, and the idea was that somehow stakeholders are part of this bigger calculation of shareholder value that's reflected in a market price. Prominent agency theorists like Michael Jensen argued that for companies to be accountable, for there to be a meaningful set of checks and balances in corporate governance, corporations need a single corporate objective, namely this kind of market price. We saw some alternative points of view derived from stakeholder theory that define corporate governance in a broader sense as a structure of rights and responsibilities of parties with a stake in the firm. So the focus in stakeholder theory is not just on the shareholders and the problem of managerial agency, but looking at a kind of broader set of issues. Now, we haven't really said that much, though, about how this would look like in practice and what it would mean, and this is part of our goal for the second part of the course. A key problem is that stakeholders have very different goals, and they also contribute different sorts of resources to the firm, different kinds of inputs. And they're affected by the firm in different ways. So what does accountability mean here? We're going to have to take a bit of a broader view than this single objective. So what could effective corporate governance really look like? Well, we could think of it as the protection of the wealth that stakeholders invest in the corporation, be those financial capital or different kinds of human capital, trust, for example. We can also think of corporate governance as playing a role in the creation of new value through common enterprise. So how well does corporate governance assist in stakeholders being cooperative and productive with one another? And a final distinct sense concerns the distribution of that corporate value among stakeholders, and the question of is that fair? Are everyone benefiting from the common enterprise and getting a kind of fair share? So how I'd like you to think about CSR is really against the background of corporate governance, and we want to think of CSR as a particular extension of corporate governance that deals with these wider claims that stakeholders might make. So we're going to look at different issues like how firms engage responsibly with those stakeholders, particularly those outside the firm. How does civil society and the public influence corporate decision making? And how can sustainability be incorporated as a criteria within the governance of the firm? So these are a bunch of issues, and the kind of question that we might want to keep in our minds in the background is, can the legitimacy and the idea that there's a business case for social responsibility help reconcile these different models or theories of corporate governance, like shareholder and agency view and entity and stakeholder view of corporate governance that we had in week 2? So does it point us back to something like an enlightened shareholder model of the corporation or not? So when we think of corporate social responsibility, we might think of a happy place, something like green energy, people around the world coming together for a social mission, or the idea of care and being responsible in the sense of caring for each other, caring for the planet Earth. On the other hand, many of us maybe say, well, I'm not sure what CSR, corporate social responsibility, really means. It's kind of a bunch of words. It's a bit nebulous, and this is easily reflected in the common culture. Here we see a company has a green culture and a passion for the brand making this a better world. I clearly hear what you're saying. So CSR has many different meanings. There's a lot of words and images associated, but do we really know very clearly what companies mean by it? And this lack of clarity about the meaning of CSR has also led critics to say that CSR is something like a management fad or fashion, something that sounds nice, that companies adopt to kind of look good. So maybe it's like a CSR fashion show. It's the hot new look of the season. We want to look green and maintain a certain kind of glamorous image. So this is kind of casting doubt. Well, is there really something meaningful and substantial behind the words and images of the CSR? In the worst case, the fear is that perhaps there's not, and that behind the recycling and the front stage of we're all doing our part, we have our paper, plastic, glass, there, behind us maybe business goes on as usual. And here in the image you see behind the scenes the smokestacks and the continued pollution. Now, what's the role of academia in this? Well, oftentimes in business schools we hear from the professors that actually social responsibility, that there's a strong business case behind it, that being responsible is not just ethical or good, but that it actually makes business sense, that by being socially responsible and by putting essentially responsibility before profits, companies may make even more profits. And so this again adds a further dimension of how we learn about corporate social responsibility and whether it's really about that kind of business case or what happens maybe when business interest and ethical concerns actually do collide. And this brings us then to something of the dark side of corporate behavior. Here we see one of our favorite villains. Join us on the dark side. Corporations, of course, need to care about their bottom line. It's part of their mission and their legal responsibilities of management to pursue profitability. And we learned early in the course the kind of idea that by being social responsibility could be a kind of means to an ends of greater value. But what happens when these things really, when we're really confronted with this dark side of making tough ethical decisions, and how do companies deal with that? So the idea behind stakeholder theory, of course, is that corporations and management of corporations have some kind of choice. There's some kind of degree of freedom or meaningful thing that companies need to think about to balance these different aims, or to choose, hopefully, the good aim of supporting the environment, supporting social causes over a purely short-term business sense. But we need to really understand much more what are companies' roles in this, what kind of choices they have to make. So oftentimes, if you ask companies, managers will say, well, yes, social responsibility is great. I wish our company could even be even more socially responsible if only the company was making more money, if only customers would honor our efforts. For example, think of fast fashion and how much customers are willing to pay for a t-shirt. We'd be more responsible if everyone could actually agree what being responsible actually means. So corporations themselves, and if you ask managers, they often say these kind of things. which indicate some limitations of their ability to be socially responsible, and that this kind of mission depends very much not just on themselves, but also their interaction with customers, the public, and the business environment. And this leads to a few key debates around CSR. For example, managers wanting to know, does CSR also improve company performance? To what extent is there really a kind of business case out there, or to what extent are these things in tension with one another? Customers and other stakeholders want to know, is CSR just a window dressing? Is it really leading to saving the planet, achieving better social and environmental outcomes? And from our point of view in this class, we want to understand academically, based on some evidence, under what conditions CSR can be an enforceable and meaningful mechanism of governance that does actually promote responsibility related to environmental, social, and also governance issues that we've been studying already. So today, I want to introduce you to what is CSR. We'll look at different definitions and where the concept comes from. And then I would like to talk a bit about the political history of CSR and how CSR relates to other kinds of governance related to state regulation. So what is CSR? Let's take a closer look. If we start with formal definitions, you can find many different ones. In Europe, of course, the European Commission has attempted to define corporate social responsibility as a concept whereby companies integrate social and environmental concerns in their business operations and in their interaction with stakeholders on a voluntary basis. Now, a key word here in the early conception of CSR is voluntary. It's something that business sort of does by itself. Now, this understanding has changed a bit over time. 10 years later, the European Commission defines CSR differently as refers to companies taking responsibility for their impact on society. It no longer says whether it's voluntarily or as part of compliance with regulation, or really kind of where it comes from. You see fairly similar ideas in different definitions, like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development talks about continuing the commitment by business to behave ethically and contribute to economic development while improving the quality of life of the workforce and their families, as well as the local community and society at large. So here we see some reference to ethics. We see some reference to different stakeholder groups like the workforce, communities, society in general. An academic definition from Wetton et al. Defines CSR as a behavior that's alleged by a stakeholder to be expected by society or morally required, and that is therefore justifiably demanded by business. So here this is referring again to behaviors of companies where stakeholders basically talk about the need for companies to be responsible, right? So it's something here to do with a discourse, a kind of discussion between stakeholders and companies about what they should do, what's required, what's expected, what's justified on business. So a core word which we need to get into is actually the word of responsibility itself. Responsibility really is a kind of moral concept. If you look in the English language dictionary, you might see responsibility defined as a state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or of having control over someone. So where parents are responsible for their children, or for example, a manager may be responsible for a certain set of tasks in the company. Here we're talking about companies being responsible or affecting some others. So a secondary definition of responsibility refers to the state or fact of being accountable or to blame for something. So we see there's here this word accountable, which means to be able to give an account for something, say some reasons why you did something. So accountability is a very good, is a little bit less of a moral concept and it's more of a political or governance concept. So when we're talking about accountability, we can unpack these duties in a few different steps. For example, the obligation of the company to inform others regarding actions and decisions. So this is about kind of information. And we'll see a lot of the CSR discussion relies on information disclosure and communication about what companies are doing. On the basis of this information, accountability also means that there's a justification of these actions and decisions to legitimate parties. So, for example, that a company will explain to stakeholders why it did something, and that if a stakeholder comes and asks why, they get some kind of answer. So accountability in the sense of discussion, giving reasons why, explaining. Now, it doesn't mean that a stakeholder agrees with those actions or decisions. The company may say, well, there were reasons why we did it. And you, as a customer or employee, may think those are not really good reasons, right? What happens then? Well, the kind of third layer of accountability is that there's some kind of potential for sanctions in the case of misconduct. So that if a stakeholder doesn't find the actions of the company to be justified, what can they actually do about it? Is there any kind of course of action for which they can put pressure on the company or kind of enforce their claim? That could be as simple as, I don't buy the product in the market, or it may be that I quit my job and work for another company. But the key here is that there has to be some kind of closing mechanism. Otherwise, if it's just a company saying stuff and there's no potential for enforcement, either by the stakeholder themselves or by a third party, then the company is not really accountable to those sets of issues. Right? Now, beyond that comes a kind of additional component to the idea of responsibility that it's not really related to the dictionary definition, but I think it's an important part of the discourse on corporate responsibility. And in fact, in some sense, the word or concept of CSR is increasingly being replaced simply by the term sustainability. Now, what does this mean? Well, it implies a kind of long-term perspective to responsibility and accountability, right? And it asks us to think about how time, about future costs, future concerns, future harm to the earth or to stakeholders becomes part of corporate governance. And it relates to kind of opposite side of sustainability is maybe something like short-termism, doing things that benefit you right now, but actually undermine the potential to have more value in a kind of longer-term future. So sustainability kind of brings in this kind of time component, not just about what's happening now, but being responsible also for future actions. Now, an important related concept to corporate social responsibility is a very old-fashioned one that we can find in microeconomics, which relates to the idea of externalities. An externality occurs when an economic activity causes external cost or external benefit to third-party stakeholders, and when those stakeholders do not directly affect the economic transaction or were not involved in decisions. A very obvious one is air pollution. Okay? Companies produce goods, the factory emits CO2 emissions, and even if you did not buy one of the products made in that factory, the contribution of the CO2 to polluted air and global warming really affects, in that case, everyone, right? So there's a kind of huge externality involved that, the consumers who buy the goods and the company that make the good don't fully internalize all the kind of costs of that air pollution, right? So here the producers and consumers in the market don't bear all the costs, or they don't reap all the benefits of an economic activity. The benefits would be, for example, if I eliminate air pollution, right? Or I plant forests, which may improve water quality and so forth. That has a lot of benefits, but I don't, as the person who plants the tree, I don't reap all the rewards of that benefit. So in some sense, I'm making a kind of gift or a positive externality to society by doing those kind of good things. So a lot of CSR relates to cases when there are certain externalities involved, when not all the costs and benefits of activity can really be made part of the contractual rights and obligations of the company toward its different stakeholders. Now, I'm talking about CSR. I keep using the word stakeholders. And yes, there is a close relationship between the study of CSR and stakeholder theory. And there's a basic notion that legitimacy, social acceptance in the eyes of different stakeholders is very important for corporations. That corporations have a kind of license to operate, that basically they're sort of accepted. Beyond that, stakeholder theory suggests that doing good for stakeholders, being responsible, goes beyond just sort of the minimum that is needed to be part of society, but by doing a bit more, companies can build a positive reputation, that they can be perceived as being very good, maybe better than the competition with regard to environment or social issues. So the content of CSR, what companies actually do, and whether or not they actually get a kind of business reward for doing so in terms of positive reputation, depends very much on the role of the particular stakeholders. And we're going to really come back to the question of stakeholders, stakeholder theory, much more next week, in which we'll have an additional conceptual idea of salient stakeholders and the condition that makes stakeholders very important for corporations. So more on this next week, but keep the idea of stakeholders in your mind today. Well, why do corporations adopt CSR? Or more generally, what are the different kind of motives that we might observe for being socially responsible, right? And in general, different studies might differentiate between three types of motives, and these may operate at sort of different levels. So first, what do I mean by motives? Well, an instrumental motive means that being responsible for social or environmental issues may be a kind of means to an end. It may be something, if you look here at the organizational level in this diagram, it may be something that a company does because, for example, shareholders want to know about the environmental impact of a product, and they may be doing it to sort of please shareholders, or at the national level, promoting more environmentally friendly companies, maybe something that, say, the German government views as sort of good for competitiveness of the German economy. Now, these instrumental motives that are associated with the business case for being good, for CSR, are one category, but they're different than, for example, relational or moral motives. Relational motives relate to the idea that there's a kind of civic duty or a particular obligation in the relationship with the stakeholder. For example, the need to address employees as an important stakeholder, which is actually part of the German rules and laws about co-determination and worker representation. There, it's not simply that it may have a positive effect on business, the bottom line, but it's actually a kind of a relational obligation, part of the civic duty of the company, and part of what they do maybe, for example, as part of their legal compliance, right? So at the national level, this may be more about, for example, the topic of social cohesion, inclusion, for example, women or ethnic minorities who have been often discriminated in the workplace. CSR activities around the topic of diversity may promote may go beyond an instrumental need to deal with those groups, but it may be something that's promoting a kind of wider set of social cohesions or fulfilling some kind of relational obligations. Now, a final set of motives would be moral ones in which individuals, organizations, or governments are really motivated by something being the right thing to do. There's a kind of ethical obligation coming perhaps from different theories like utilitarianism or Kantian type of ethics or many other kinds of ethics. But there's simply an argumentation here in the sense of being motivated that I am being responsible simply because there's a moral duty to be so, regardless of any instrumental benefits or costs, regardless of whether or not there's a kind of civic or relational obligation to do so. Okay? And any of these motives you can find at the level of, say, an individual manager, the company, government, but then also extending beyond this to transnational dimensions like intergovernmental entities like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and so forth, or extending to different kind of corporate interest groups and NGOs, for example, like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, which operate quite globally. So oftentimes we think of CSR, therefore, as a process of social change in which different actors, different kinds of stakeholders, but also governments, following different kinds of motives, be they instrumental, moral, or relational, create pressures on companies through different kind of mechanisms, lead corporations to adopt and change their policies and stances toward CSR issues. It can be like that employees create pressures inside the company to do more. They relate to the commitment of the company and the kind of citizenship activities. Outside stakeholders may put pressure to change strategic decisions or may express voice toward the corporations. Governments may enact laws or change the enforcement of laws to create pressure, and NGOs may engage in campaigns, boycotts, or different kinds of dialogues. And so from all these different groups and for all these different motives, at the end of the day, it comes down to a certain set of CSR activities, which companies then adopt, change, develop, or not, to promote different kinds of social change. So if we get down to some specific details, when we're talking about CSR activities at the level of the company, usually these are divided between economic or governance aspects, environmental aspects, and social aspects. And typically you might see a list of things like this, like economic criteria of responsibility related to codes of conduct and corruption, related to good corporate governance and investor relations that we've been talking about, also related to risk management and crisis management, and relationships to customers. So all of these things which we are familiar with already can also here be looked at as part of CSR. Usually we tend to think maybe more of the next two areas, environmental aspects such as environmental performance related to energy, greenhouse gases, water, waste, and so forth. We may think of environmental policy like reporting, making certain kinds of targets, verifying those targets, and reporting such as the scope of environmental reporting. Social issues are quite complex and represent this third dimension. They may relate to fairly familiar things such as labor practices like diversity, equal remuneration, stable employment. May also relate to employee rights such as freedom of association or grievance resolution mechanisms. Related to this, human capital, talent attraction and retention, all of those things that we might normally understand as part of human resource management are here kind of reinterpreted as a in terms of a social responsibility for management, right? Now, social issues go a bit beyond that, such as the impact on labor of sort of global supply chains, engagement with stakeholders, but also corporate citizenship and philanthropy programs. It's important to remember that philanthropy is an element of CSR, but it's certainly not the biggest or most important element, just one of many of these different activities. And finally, having a kind of system of social reporting. So typically, when we're talking about CSR practices, we're talking about things which already existed without calling them CSR, but the concept of CSR sort of invites you to think about them together and think of these set of issues as a more holistic set of issues. So let's explain this a step further with regard to environment. So if we look at what environmental responsibility might mean, it might mean something like ecological efficiency, establishing key performance indicators for energy use, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, water use and waste management. It means setting certain kind of policies, often with kind of quantitative targets, making those publicly available so that stakeholders can know and understand what they are. And this is that information element of accountability. Holding companies accountable for environment means that we need information about what they're doing, and also having third-party verification of those. Right? So the reporting is a very important element of this as well. And when we think about sustainable development and the concept of sustainability, we're really talking about where all of these social, environmental, and economic aspects are kind of working together, right? So if something is economically good and doesn't harm the environment too much, it's viable, but in some sense it's maybe happening at a social cost, which make it, not good in the long term, or something maybe socially and environmentally good, but places cost on the environment. Something may be good for society and the environment, but if it has no economic foundation, then it's also not really sustainable. So sustainability is, in some sense, an intersection where these three things feed into each other in a positive way in the long term. So I gave you some definitions of CSR at the beginning, and you're going to encounter very many different definitions in this course and outside. And you'll see that they tend to have some common emphasis on CSR referring to something that companies do, that it's something self-regulated, or it's a kind of private part of how business governs itself. And so you can compare whether or not definitions of CSR stress voluntarism or how they present legally mandated behavior. You can compare definitions about whether they look at CSR in terms of multi-stakeholder initiatives involving stakeholders together in setting, monitoring, and implementing environmental and social goals, or whether they're kind of business-led, meaning firms just adopt and apply the standards by themselves. And you can also look in terms of ethics. Is there a kind of ethical standard for understanding what constitutes responsible behavior? Is it externally defined, like in relation to certain kind of ethics or even religious standard? Or is it just sort of managers define it any way they want, and so forth? And particularly with regarding to ethics, there's a different emphasis within the CSR discussion about doing good versus avoiding irresponsible behavior, doing no harm. And we'll kind of come back to this like thing of responsible and irresponsible and how they relate to each other at a few different times during this course. The different definitions of CSR and the very fact that it has to do with the perceptions and expectations of stakeholders gives CSR a particular property as a concept. We might call this that CSR is a contested concept. CSR is really a kind of social construction, meaning that people make it, that there's no really consensus exactly how to measure or exactly what constitutes responsible behavior. Different people may have different views on this, and as we come to share a certain common understanding, this is essentially defines what CSR is. So the very meaning of what it is to be responsible, what corporations should do, is a source of contestation and conflict. We have the background, a shadow of the law and legal rules and regulation. On the other hand, we have the involvement of different stakeholders. And from this kind of process, different groups construct or make CSR in a certain way. But this certain way is always changing. It's going to be different in different societies. In the United States, CSR is very much associated with voluntary measures and very explicit policies adopted by companies. But in Scandinavia, or to some extent Germany, CSR may be more implicit. It may be about being a good citizen, complying with regulation, or following other kinds of social norms. So this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to define CSR, just because I say, for example, this was my definition or my understanding. Other people, NGOs, employees, managers, investors, will have a different view of what it really means to be socially responsible. And CSR, in some sense, is an outcome of all of this. That's why we refer to it as a contested concept. So within this, we can think of also a kind of spectrum or distinction about what responsibility means. And again, the different groups may have very different understandings. But basically, from the view of any stakeholder or any kind of issue like the environment, products, employees, community, etc., You can think of responsibility on one hand as meaning do no harm. For example, for the environment, I want to minimize my environmental footprint. Or you can think of being responsible as being like a positive force, going beyond this, being at the forefront of sustainable innovation. So, for example, doing no harm to a community might mean avoiding a negative certain impact. But just avoiding a negative impact is not the same as making a positive contribution to well-being. Similarly, think about compliance with government regulation. Well, I can follow the letter of the law. I can do nothing that's illegal, but it doesn't mean that companies are doing things that are kind of above and beyond, maybe in the spirit of the rules, rather than just in the letter of the rules. So for any stakeholder, we could kind of go through these things, and we can imagine a sort of range of ways of being responsible that kind of go from the do no harm all the way to the more positive force. And this relates also to some different aims or objectives of CSR from the point of view of the company, whether they're following something like a business case, so that the company wants to be a kind of leader in a particular kind of CSR area, that they want to follow best practices and differentiate themselves from other companies by doing more. In that case, CSR can be a way of gaining reputation among their stakeholders, and it can really be part of supporting their competitive advantage by sort of doing a little bit beyond what other companies do. And if I go back to the last slide for a moment, this fits a bit with the kind of positive force side of this diagram, right? Now, the other way is more of this do no harm. And to come back there, we could think of the company being inspired by more like of an insurance logic. So they want to make sure that they comply with kind of minimum standards, that the company is not harming stakeholders, that they're kind of being a good citizen. And by doing no harm, the company might prevent losses of reputation or lower the risks of having irresponsible behavior by really making sure, okay, we follow a kind of minimum code of conduct in all practices. Doesn't mean that they're going to be a leader then in CSR and getting at this kind of competitive advantage, but it may also kind of economically protect them, kind of like buying an insurance protects you against negative events. So now I'd like to come to second big topic for today, how CSR relates to other kinds of government regulation and regulatory institutions. So to think about this, we can think of two different models of basically the sociopolitics of how business is embedded in society. One model, a kind of standard model that maybe you've encountered in economics class, for example, thinking about externalities, is that you have state regulation based in law. So the government will look at things that where there's a market failure, and they're going to put regulations in place to guarantee the public good and to kind of police and regulate the behavior of companies. And this regulation is enforced by the state itself through its administrative agencies, or to some extent by private actors. For example, they may file a lawsuit or something against a company. And these kind of rules are basically aimed at promoting the public interest, particularly where there might be cases of market failure, such as environmental issues or labor standards. Now, thinking about responsibilities from a CSR perspective is rather different, and here it's not the state that's the basis of the regulatory model, but it's something like a voluntary self-regulation of companies. Companies should be basically regulating themselves. Well, how could that be enforced? Here, the idea is that enforcement occurs through private actors through the support of market mechanisms. For example, an investor might not invest in a green company, or will be more likely to invest in a company that has CO2 minimizing technologies in the future. So here, for example, in environment, the stock market or other kinds of markets like the labor market or product market kind of give feedback to companies about whether or not they're meeting the expectations of society and different stakeholders, and that this kind of market-based system should allow companies to essentially kind of self-regulate. And here, it's not a strict system of rules, of course, but companies are following principles such as, supporting sustainable development goals, and basically their responsible activities focus on the positive sum dimensions, the areas in which private goods and social goods positively reinforce one another, where it's not a case of like a trade-off between doing good and doing good business, but really where those things sort of overlap. So I think you can see that both of these models have a certain interesting quality. They're different, and they each have their own logic, which kind of makes sense in its own term. But I hope that you also see that they kind of will be doing different things. And for example, the regulatory model will be much stronger on the public interest side, whereas the CSR model might engage companies more. And to some extent, these different models fit a little bit more of the do no harm in the regulatory model and the positive view expressed on the other side of the diagram here in the CSR model. So within the CSR, though, you have kind of some further distinction. Well, should that self-regulation be driven just only by business, like individual companies or groups of companies literally regulate themselves? Or a kind of hybrid way of doing that might be to have a kind of self-regulation, but where different stakeholders are involved in the setting of a kind of framework for that self-regulation and establishing a certain kind of common set of rules. And this is the case in so-called multi-stakeholder arrangements, where the kind of way of doing CSR is sort of negotiated and then put into the marketplace. So looking at this relation of CSR to the regulatory model, you can see that in some cases these overlap quite a lot. That when we think of behavior that's sort of legal and behavior that's responsible for a corporation, often these things go together, and that's represented by the middle circle of this diagram. But there's a lot of rules and regulations and laws which are not necessarily have a moral component. That doesn't mean that we're doing good just because we follow the law. And similarly, there's a lot of areas of what would be responsible from a moral point of view is not really covered within the legal framework and somehow falls outside. This is something like a gray zone in which businesses have to reflect and think a little bit more about what it means to be responsible rather than just going for strict legal compliance. So a lot of these times things go together, but it gets quite interesting for our subject to realize that there's this kind of gray area that needs to be filled in through company level CSR. Now, how did we get here to this kind of distinctive model of CSR as really a kind of alternative model to the kind of regulatory state that we're familiar with and have been taught for many years as in the kind of basic political economy model. And to understand this, we need to think a bit about history, about the changing role of the state itself vis-a-vis corporations. Here I'd like to make 3 points. First being that the regulatory capacity of nation states is arguably in somewhat of a long-term decline. Multinational enterprises are footloose global entities. They span across the world. They move very rapidly. And that in some sense means that it weakens the capacity for a nation state to really regulate companies within its own borders, because companies may simply shift activities to other regulatory jurisdictions. And an easy example of that, of course, is, for example, tax avoidance, and the way in which companies like Starbucks, for example, will set up their accounting across different sort of subsidiaries, the restaurants or cafes, which tend not to make a lot of profit or not to declare a lot of profit, don't get taxes, but then you have the wholesale subsidiary in Switzerland of Starbucks, which is making very high levels of profit based on the transactions with other subsidiaries. So a lot of the profits of Starbucks, for example, are not realized in the place where the stores are and kind of fall under the regulation of a nation state where the activity is taking place, but the economic activity is sort of shifted or moved to another place like Switzerland where the tax laws are more generous. Now, next time you order an Amazon package, for example, look at the label where it comes, and you may see that it comes from Amazon, and you may see something about Amazon Luxembourg. Well, your package didn't get sent from Luxembourg to Germany, but the Amazon that you're dealing with is oftentimes not a German Amazon, but one located in another state, again with more favorable tax laws. So you might say, why does this kind of continue, that countries are basically kind of competing with each other in a kind of race to the bottom way to make less regulation and more favorable conditions for business profitability? And here, just to say that there's a lot of difficulties in terms of intergovernmental coordination, which continue to limit this kind of capacity. So this is one dimension. Another dimension might fall under something like the term neoliberalism, and a pervasive set of political ideas that have promoted deregulation and privatization over the last decades. Some of the origins of this come from the 1980s and the kind of time of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the US and UK, who would argue that government is not a solution, but government is actually a problem. So there was a climate in which business was seeking to kind of liberate itself from regulations, and maybe a decade or later or so, for example, also in Germany, if you look at the Social Democratic Party, that traditional left-wing political parties also kind of shifted to a much more pro-market stance, and where the government no longer sought to regulate everything themselves, but putting back some social responsibilities onto companies. And even after the 2008 financial crisis, you can see that relatively few efforts were made to re-regulate financial markets. So neoliberalism, as a kind of political economic doctrine, sees the role of the state as very small and sees the roles of private companies as being quite large and important. And it's really here in this kind of gap in the discussion that corporate responsibility becomes a big term and gets framed in a way as a kind of alternative to state regulation. So even in Germany, where we have quite strong business regulation, CSR was something that was like very much about voluntary activities that go beyond those legal mandates, but which then, shouldn't be regulated. And in this way, corporate responsibility became associated with a kind of business case, justification for CSR, and we see the emergence of some kind of more market-based system to evaluate companies in relation to social and environmental issues. So in some sense, to sum all that up, the role of the state is getting smaller in some sense, or changing in another sense in response to these circumstances. Neoliberalism might express the idea that government should not too strongly regulate companies, and that corporate responsibility is really a responsibility of corporations themselves. But what about responsibility today in contemporary politics? For example, when governments themselves are being irresponsible. Well, let's take a look at, in Brazil, for example, the response to a major environmental catastrophe of an oil spill, where the Secretary of Agriculture and Fisheries said the following: "The fish is a very intelligent creature. When he sees an oil slick, he runs away. He has fear. So obviously you can eat your fish without any problem. Your fish, your lobster, your prawns, it's all perfectly sound." Bolsonaro himself, sitting next to him, said, "Well, once in a while a turtle gets caught in the oil slick. Not to mention no one gets caught in the oil slick, right? A turtle, a dolphin, but a fish." When confronted with the melting of the Arctic, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the following: "The Arctic is at the forefront of opportunity and abundance. It houses 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of undiscovered gas, abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, diamonds, millions of square miles of untapped resources, fisheries galore. Steady reductions in sea ice are opening up new passageways and new opportunities for trade. This could potentially slash the time it takes to travel between Asia and the West by as much as 20 days. Arctic sea lanes could become the 21st century Suez and Panama canals." So again, under this condition, it's obvious that we can't rely solely on government, particularly governments that have been adopted populist rhetoric and are, for example, take unscientific stances toward the environment. So CSR as a model of regulation. How does it look? Well, the first model I was proposing to you, we see state regulation, in which there's kind of a hierarchical relation between governments to corporations, and self-regulation, or the kind of CSR model. I distinguish between two types of pure self-regulation, kind of business-led, where corporations regulate each other, or a kind of soft law approach in which there's a multi-stakeholder co-regulation between civil society, government, and the private sector, all three of them working together in soft law. So CSR is just meaning proposing a different form of regulation, one that changes the relationship between governments and corporations. And so an ultimate question that we're going to look at in more detail in the course is, to what extent within this new model does a market create a demand for responsible good behavior, what author David Fogel calls a market for virtue. And we see a few channels by which this might happen: through consumer demand, like when companies can market their products with a CSR label like fair trade, or which they can avoid boycotts, for example, of bad behavior like Nike. Employees may demand CSR by rewarding companies through being a popular place to work, being a desirable workplace, or when employees inside the company create pressure, such as employees from Merck who pressure the company to make drugs more widely available to the developing world. Shareholders and investors can also demand virtue through SRI funds, mainstreaming of corporate SRI practices, and demands for disclosures related to CSR or non-financial performance. Can be other sources, the values held by managers and employees, local community or government pressure. So the question is not so much state versus CSR, but how do these things really work together? And we can think about this in the following way, that CSR may be a complement or a mirror from formal regulation. For example, mandatory disclosure rules about social and environmental information leads to greater comparability of corporate practices and may encourage adoption of CSR measures. Information can be used by stakeholders to be more in power. So in the sense, CSR activities may be kind of a mirror or extension from formal regulation. Of course, as regulatory standards increase, regulation may diminish the business case for CSR. Standards become more uniform, and firms, when standards are high, have less scope to differentiate themselves via strong binding norms. So we can imagine a set of dynamics where CSR flows from high standards of formal regulation. We can also imagine where CSR may substitute for formal regulation. There's oftentimes the political lobby of firms supporting CSR often goes hand in hand with a business agenda to promote deregulation. This is very strong in the case of Germany. And we also see that CSR is sometimes adopted by multinational firms in order to kind of fill in gaps or regulatory voids, for example, in emerging economies where you have a weak rule of law or weak formal institutions. So we can imagine different ways in which CSR can complement regulation, but also in some sense can substitute for it. So when we look around the world, given these differences in regulatory background, we see that countries are positioned differently in terms of their average level of CSR activities. This is measured at the level of individual stock exchange listed companies and shows you an average level of CSR just related here to the social dimension, not the environmental one. And you see in all the kind of advanced industrialized countries around the world, comparing the blue to the green line, that there's a general kind of increase in average scores over the last years. So there's a trend around the world to more CSR. Now, one of the leading countries is France, where there's quite a lot of state intervention, and we could imagine that CSR flows from as a kind of mirror of that strong regulation. For example, France was a country who very early required companies to engage in social reporting. The UK, on the other hand, is a more deregulated, liberal market economy, and here high levels of CSR probably act more kind of like a substitute. You see, Germany is among the kind of, leading countries of CSR. It's kind of in the top third, whereas, say, United States or Japan are sort of in the low middle, and some smaller countries like New Zealand or Greece, Mexico are quite low. Of course, these are just basic scores, and if we do a more precise comparison to take account of the characteristics of companies, their size, their sector, profitability, we can do a little bit of a closer comparison. And so here we've benchmarked countries vis-a-vis Germany in 2013. And again, here I would say Germany seems to be more middle of the field, higher than some countries like the United States or Japan, quite substantially, but a bit behind other leading countries like France, Sweden, UK, or Spain. So Germany is probably falling in the middle level of countries in terms of CSR. Well, an interesting question to ask, what about the understanding of CSR not just as policies to do good, but this aspect of doing no harm, not having a negative impact on stakeholders. And for this, we can calculate a corresponding score of corporate irresponsibility on social issues by counting the number of scandals or other kind of activities in which companies may be engaged in unethical behaviors. If we look at this data and plot it against each other, an interesting thing is the generally positive relationship between being more responsibility, more policies for doing good, actually being associated with higher levels of irresponsible behavior. And I'd like to point out the position, for example, of the United States, which has very high levels of scandals and irresponsibility, and a more kind of average level of adopting policies for doing good. Meanwhile, countries like Spain, Denmark, Sweden, for example, are a bit like you'd expect, high levels of socially responsible behavior and a kind of below average level of doing bad things. Now, Germany, along with some other countries like France or the UK, is in a kind of interesting position of being very high on both. So we see lots of positive initiatives taken by German companies, but still a lot of persistence of scandals and other types of problems. And we can imagine, for example, that sometimes CSR policies are adopted as a response to a problem. For example, there's a crisis like the Volkswagen crisis, and perhaps as a result from that, Volkswagen may adopt more new kind of socially responsible practices. The interesting thing here is this level of high levels of bad behavior tend to persist for a very long time, and this may cast some doubt on the effectiveness of CSR. This is something we're going to come back to in more detail in later weeks. What's the relation between good behaviors and bad behaviors, and what are the kind of dynamics by which these things might influence each other? So, thinking as a kind of wrapping up about whether or not a company is kind of sustainable, we can imagine quite a range of things. A company which is destructive to the environment or to stakeholders, that's sort of minimally self-interested, that complies more or less with socially acceptable legal rules. Some companies going beyond that to be quite good citizens, public-spirited, and then maybe a very few companies who do lots of good things and don't do a lot of harm. So there's quite a lot of range when we're talking about CSR in the degrees of positive activity. So for today, what to remember: the different motives for CSR, the ways of comparing definitions of CSR, and these two different models of CSR, basically the relationship between the more traditional government regulation of corporations and a kind of self-governing model of corporate responsibility, which we now associated with contemporary CSR. So on that note, have a good week. And I look forward to discussing these points.